Good morning, and thank you for joining us on this waterfront webinar on climate change and environmental impact assessment, the impact of changing environmental policy on conducting EIAs. Climate change and biodiversity loss has been a primary concern of environmentalists for decades. In recent years, however, the urgency of the situation and the recognition of a state of emergency has finally reached the mainstream public, and I believe this was catalysed as a result of the actions of Greta Thunberg and the Extinction Rebellion. In response to the public outcry of the state of emergency, local and national government have also belatedly declared a state of emergency. However, the economy rolls on. There are houses and roads to be built, airports to be expanded, nuclear power stations, high-speed rails, spaceports, bridges, wind farms, solar arrays, underground extensions, super sewers, flood defences, tidal barrages, and in the cities, towers to erect. So what has changed? With a greater focus on reducing carbon emissions and the target of reaching net zero by 2050, how is the state of emergency actually impacting planning for new infrastructure and conducting environmental impact assessments? With the help of three expert panelists, this free webinar will explore these issues and to discuss how to carry out environmental impact assessments of new developments in light of the wider changing environmental policy and case law in the UK. The format for today's webinar will be a short summary from each of our speakers on the topics at hand, followed by a panel discussion and audience Q&A, which I will moderate and lead. Before we begin properly, I'll make some short introductions. My name is Dr. Rufus Howard, and I'm the Impact Assessment Policy Lead for the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, EIAMA. EIAMA is the home of environment and sustainability professionals, and through its impact assessment network, EIA Quality Mark and EIA Practitioner Register provides accreditation, standards, guidance, and innovative best practice in impact assessment. As a chartered environmentalist, fellow of EIAMA and registered principal EIA practitioner, I've been working in impact assessment since 2004, with a focus primarily on EIA of nationally significant infrastructure projects, particularly renewable energy, and international due diligence on environmental and social impact assessment for international financial institutions. Today, our three expert panelists are Lucy Wood, Director at Barton Wilmore, Luke Strickland, Environmental Team Lead at Mott MacDonald, and Ben Stansfield, Partner at Gowling WLG. I'll now give a brief introduction to our first speaker, Lucy Wood. Lucy is the Director of the National Infrastructure and Environmental Planning Team at Barton Wilmore. She advises on environmental, socioeconomic, health and sustainability issues for major developments at the plan and project levels. Her career spans engineering, environmental consultancy, and environmental planning in the UK and internationally. Lucy is advising clients of the climate mitigation and adaptation issues relating to various developments, including the challenges and opportunities relating to climate change emergency and net zero policies. Her project experience includes new settlements, urban regeneration, energy and infrastructure projects. Lucy also reviews sustainability appraisals and environmental statements on behalf of developers and local planning authorities in accordance with the EIAMA EIA Quality Mark accreditation. Lucy is a chartered environmentalist, full member of EIAMA, registered EIA practitioner, and associate of the RTPI. Her current interests include proportionate EIA, health and climate change, and she's presented or arranged industry events on these topics. Lucy was on the steering group for EIAMA's Global Environmental, Social and Assessment Group, GESA, and EIAMA Working Group on Digital Impact Assessment. So that's from me. I'll now hand over to Lucy.
Thank you, Rufus, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be able to take part in this clearly a hot topic, and particularly in light of all of the information in the press at the moment on the critical need for a green economic recovery from COVID-19. So I'll just cover 4 points in my introductory remarks and look forward to discussing through Q&A later. So really a start point for this is I was just thinking what the ultimate purpose is of EIA to start with, which is to inform the decision-making process and to make those in that consenting process aware of the likely significant effects on the environment. And climate change, certainly for us practitioners, has been tricky to get our heads around, really, because we're used to looking at a red line boundary for an infrastructure or development project, looking at the baseline and then what the impacts would be with and without development. But clearly, climate change is a global issue. So how you square that scale problem is difficult. So the way I've been looking at it is, do we maybe need two levels, two scales, a micro or site scale, and then the macro scale about how the project would contribute to the shift to a low carbon economy. So that's one idea. And obviously the IEMA guidance is very helpful, that's been put together by IEMA and a couple of consultancies, and particularly the guidance around greenhouse gas emissions and how you assess that through EIA. But of course, the main point there is that all greenhouse gas emissions are potentially significant when you consider them cumulatively. So then linking back to where I started, well, what's the purpose of EIA? It's to inform decision makers on likely significant effects of the environment. And there lies the problem. If you're saying really that every project that emits any greenhouse gases could have a potentially significant effect because you have to consider it cumulatively, well, how useful is that to the decision maker? And how, as practitioners, can we help them differentiate between significant and really significant, or which I think is why we need almost to think about the macro scale again. So how would that infrastructure or development help the UK path to a lower carbon economy and to that net zero target that governments do?
I think we may have lost Lucy's audio for a moment. We'll just see if it's going to come back. Yep.
It's come back, I hope. Back.
Yep, back.
Yeah,
Great.
good. Okay, good. Excellent. Sorry. So secondly, I just want to touch on quickly outline applications. And we're all used to assessing parameter envelopes. Obviously that's been part of EIA for a long time, since the very famous Rochdale case, and looking at worst case scenarios. But clearly with greenhouse gas emissions, particularly when you're considering, obviously, climate change mitigation, this is often heavily assumptions based at the outline stage. And so again, just questioning how useful and how accurate is this sort of assessment when then, as I say, linking back to decision-making process, you're having to make some, really quite broad assumptions when undertaking those assessments. And obviously quite a large amount of crystal ball gazing. But I think where EIA can really help is as a tool to influencing and embedding climate change mitigation, but also adaptation and resilience into projects. So rather than just worrying about assessing the impact of that final scheme going for approval, to take a really holistic view. And I think as practitioners, we've got a duty to really embed ourselves into those design teams and with the clients promoting the infrastructure or development project, to make sure that some really joined up thinking is going throughout that design process, so that actually the development that we're putting before those decision makers that have got the hard task of deciding, whether or not these effects are significant and how they should be judged in the planning balance, that there's a good scheme there that actually is future proof, that really does take account of its impact, both in terms of mitigating effects of climate change, but also providing a resilient project. And I think that is where we can really, really add value. And so I guess then, when we go back to looking at that planning balance, it's only one document, then the environmental statement, that's taken into account. So what we really need is, as good as the EIA can be, what we really need is strong policy signals.
Lucy, the last thing we heard was strong policy signals.
Oh, sorry, it's dropping out again.
That's all right.
Yeah, strong policy. I'm back. Strong policy signals, so that great, okay. And to give investors that certainty, so we can then facilitate that green recovery, I think, post-COVID, which is absolutely essential. And I guess the last point I wanted to make is, yes, we need strong top-down policy, so that when decision makers are looking at the ES and the planning balance, they have clear direction to the sort of development and infrastructure projects that they should be consenting. But then one interesting question I wanted to throw into the mix is a possible tension between the top-down approach and localism. And then looking at climate change impacts, both mitigation and adaptation, is clearly the local matters. If you live in a really urban location, it's very different from being somewhere very rural. It's different where you are in the country, both in terms of your lifestyle, that the changes that you can make easily to mitigate climate change, but also how you'll be affected by changing climate. you know, some places are much more prone to those extreme weather events we've been seeing, both heat and obviously and flood. So I think there's a real balance between a top-down approach, but also we need to think flexibly at the local level, you know, acknowledging that there's certainly not a one-size-fits-all approach. So I hope that's given everyone some food for thought. And thanks, back to you, Rufus.
Thank you, Lucy. I forgot to say earlier that as your questions come to you, please feel free to type them into the question bar, and I'll be curating and asking them at the end. So if anything Lucy said has triggered a question or a comment, please put it in the question bar and we'll come back to it in the group discussion. I'll now briefly introduce our next speaker, Luke Strickland, Environment Team Lead at Mott MacDonald. With a mixed background of environment and engineering, Luke is the Environment Team Lead at Mott MacDonald. Luke's mission is to make environmental issues more visible and understandable to clients, colleagues, and decision makers at all stages of the project lifecycle, leading to better decision making and positive environmental outcomes. Luke is used to undertaking and coordinating environmental assessments for major infrastructure schemes and providing meaningful environmental input for business cases and design, as well as during construction. He's also a writer and speaker on topics including climate resilience and blue-green infrastructure, and leads Mott MacDonald's environment team in the Midlands. Over to you, Luke.
Thanks, Rufus, and really grateful to be on the call today. It's nice to do waterfront conferences, and it's even nicer to be invited back. So thanks to the organisers for that. I'm really interested in the things that Lucy said so far, and I'm glad to say that I'm not going to repeat those, but hopefully I'm going to build on them. Thoughts that have been swirling around my head around this whole issue of climate change and EIA, I will just share a few with you now. So, I mean, I do wonder whether we need to reorient the way we do EIA in response to the climate crisis, so that the climate issues are central and not bolt-on. I think if we reflect on the last 10 years, you know, it has been hard, I think, to undertake meaningful climate change assessments at sometimes in some of our schemes, and we found it hard to do that. And I think part of that is that there's a language issue, you know, that Lucy's already talked about significance, and actually, you know, every ton of CO2 is significant. So how do we deal with that and reconcile some of that? And I think also we need to make sure that as an EIA community that we're part of the solution, not part of the problem. So we're not just entrenched in the way that we do things and so, well, we've always done it this way, and this is fine, and we're, you know, we are the people that are championing this. You know, we need to be part of the solution rather than actually be an obstruction to doing things perhaps assessing things in a new way, or being more flexible, as Lucy said, about how we look at some of these things. A key message, I think, for all of the way that we do EIA going forward is to change the message. You know, in the first 50 years of EIA, there was very much a focus on not making things worse. You know, we're not making things worse, and that's okay. We really need to move now to how are we making things better? And I think, you know, there's opportunity perhaps at scoping stage to state scheme ambition and not just set out the process. And you know, maybe you could do that by tying into some of the targets under the Sustainable Development Goals to say, well, actually, this scheme is meeting these goals, you know, to make things better in this way. But I think for real impact, we need to make sure that we're contributing to business case and the kind of consideration of alternatives stages, so that the right schemes are coming forward in the first place. Because I think we've probably all worked on schemes where we've felt a dissonance where you know, maybe the scheme isn't the right scheme after all, in terms of the environment and in terms of climate. And I think Lucy's already mentioned this thing about you know, strong policy signals, and we know we've got that right at the top. We've got this net zero ambition, but that's going to take time to cascade down. And I think in the meantime, there's going to be a tension in the industry, because we're going to be asked to undertake EIA on solutions that maybe don't stack up. You know, those bypass schemes that have been knocking around for 20 years, that we maybe need to fundamentally reconsider, especially in a post-COVID world. So I think as a community, we need to be prepared to to give bold challenge until that kind of stated national ambition truly starts to cascade into the right types of projects, and therefore those better decisions that we've been talking about. And then I guess a final point, and this ties back into something that Lucy mentioned. You know, we need to think harder about how we make the key issues more visible in our reporting. And I suppose this is linked to the proportionality debate that's been going on for ages. But I think especially around climate, you know, we want this to be the golden thread that weaves through all of our assessments and all of the topics that we look at. But you know, we face a risk that some of the key decision-making messages about climate change and the other important environmental topics that we're looking at can get lost in reams of defensive reporting due to the risk of legal challenge. And I think perhaps especially in the area of climate change, I know Ben is going to come on to this, where actually our citizens are demanding more, and you know, that is expressing itself through legal challenge. So, you know, and maybe we've got to ask the question, if we're having to be really, really defensive about the way we are assessing something, are we doing something fundamentally wrong in the first place? So those are my starter for 10. Really looking forward to hearing some of your questions later on. Back to you, Rufus.
Thank you, Ben. Some excellent points there, which we'll return to. I'll now introduce our third speaker. Sorry, Luke. I was looking at Ben's name on my sheet. And now introduce our third speaker, Ben. Ben Stansfield is one of the UK's leading lawyers practicing planning and environmental law. Ben is based in the London office and brings with him a wealth of experience advising clients on consenting and regulation of their projects and their compliance with environmental regulations and reporting standards. In addition to his advisory and transactional practices, a substantial part of Ben's work is contentious, and he has enjoyed a number of successes, both bringing and defending challenges to planning permissions and environmental consents. Ben is highly regarded for his straightforward approach, and clients appreciate his ability to break down complex regulations into user-friendly, practical advice that they can action. Ben is a former vice chair of the United Kingdom Environmental Law Association, UKLA, and was a trustee of UKLA for 8 years. Ben speaks internationally on UK and European environmental law issues and represents a number of overseas law firms with specialist elements of their transactions. Ben is recommended for both planning and environmental law in both Legal 500 and Chambers and Partners, and also features in Who's Who's environmental law. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Rufus. Good morning, everybody. So as the token lawyer on the panel, I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change and net zero and how that's being used in the courts, both to challenge government policy and specific projects, the like of which will all have required environmental impact assessment. And as you know, environmental impact assessment has for a long time been a fertile ground for JR challenges, and the usual route applies. Developer prepares and submits an environmental statement, decision maker grants permission or development consent, and then a third party crops up, sometimes out of nowhere, and seeks to judicially review that decision on the grounds of an inadequate or defective environmental statement. But I think we're seeing, or at least potentially seeing, a new ground of challenge to infrastructure or large EIA projects of the nature that many of you listening this morning are working on, and that's using the net zero argument. And we're also seeing some challenges against policy and not just the project, and that's something we've had in the past in relation to nuclear, for example, but it doesn't crop up every day, and we've had a couple this year, so that's quite interesting. So the next few minutes, I'm just going to give you a whistle-stop tour of some recent climate challenges in the courts. Firstly, climate change or net zero as a ground to challenge policy. So the big case here, which many of you will be familiar with, is the Plan B case, the Heathrow challenge. And I'll talk about this very briefly, and then I'll talk about the energy policy case that's about to kick off. So in relation to the Plan B Earth, a little bit of chronology. So in 2015, the Paris agreements were concluded following COP21, the UN International Climate Conference. And that agreement set out an aspiration to hit net zero emissions in the latter half of the 21st century. And essentially, the aim was to reduce carbon emissions well below an average 2-degree temperature increase against pre-industrial levels, and ideally much closer to 1.5 degrees. The UK ratified the Paris Agreement in December 2016, and then in June 2018, our Secretary of State for Transport adopted the airport's NPS, which would recommend the third runway at Heathrow. And in that airport's NPS, there was no reference to the Paris commitments. So a number of claimants brought a challenge, and it ended up in the Court of Appeal, who gave judgment in February. And they ruled that the airport's NPS had not taken account of the UK's Paris commitments, which by now have been enshrined in the Climate Change Act 2008. So effectively declared that the government had to go and revisit and reformulate airports policy. Now, Heathrow's subsequently or recently appealed to the Supreme Court, and they've been given excuse me, leave to appeal. So I think watch this space. But the key takeaway for now on the Heathrow case is that, you know, the Paris Agreement, or now Net Zero or the Climate Change Act 2008, because that was put into primary legislation, that has to be taken into account into all new government policy formulations. And given the scrutiny, as Luke said, given the public scrutiny of climate change and the understanding we have, you know, all those policies are going to be very closely examined for their compliance or their contribution to net zero. So I think government policy from now on will be quite explicit in how policy helps move that forward. Now, following the Plan B case, there's been a challenge brought to the BEIS energy policy, the energy NPS. So a consortium or triumvirate or combination of, you know, series of claimants, Dale Vince, the founder of Ecotricity, the Good Law Project, and George Monbiot, the environmental campaigner, have come together to request BEIS to review the energy NPSs. Now, the energy NPSs were adopted back in July 2011. This was back in the days of 8% targets, and they permit fossil fuel-based energy sources. And if you think that you know, July 2011 might not seem so long ago, these energy NPSs were adopted when Chris Huhne, remember him, was Secretary of State. Now, Section 6 of the Planning Act says that Secretary of State must review NPSs when they're appropriate. And in terms of considering whether it's appropriate, the Secretary of State needs to look at whether there's been a significant change of circumstances, whether the change hasn't been anticipated at the time, and if there's a potential for material difference in policy. So our claimant trio requested a review of the energy NPS, given the Climate Change Act Net Zero and on the back of Plan B, and they got knocked back by BEIS. BEIS said, we're already considering review. We've been considering one for some time, but we're just not quite sure when we're going to get round to it. So a judicial review challenge in relation to that decision to decline the review has been brought in mid-May. I don't believe it's yet been considered on the papers, but the claimants are obviously confident of their case. Key takeaway now, well, obviously we need to see what happens in the Supreme Court on the Heathrow case, but you know, there's absolute logic in what the claimants are saying, that you know, there was a significant change of circumstance, and that likely would result in a material difference in policy. So if successful, it's further precedent for more government policy to be updated following net zero. There's also a challenge being brought to the Highways England 5-year transport programme. I'm not sure that challenge has been brought yet, but there's certainly been quite a lot of publicity online that Transport Action Networks, as claimants, are raising funds and again challenging the road investment strategy too in relation to net zero. So what about challenges to projects? Well, we've had Chris Packham and HS2. I think this was one of the first post-lockdown virtual hearings. So Chris Packham, as claimant, challenged high-speed rail 2 decision or the Secretary of State for Transport's decision to proceed with HS2 and sought an interim injunction to prevent the destruction of 6 woodlands. And there were a couple of climate change arguments that were raised in relation to this, saying that the decision to proceed failed to take account of the fact that carbon emissions during construction would not be at the lower end of undertakers' expectations, and that they'd failed to consider 2050 carbon emissions targets and beyond. The court said, totally unarguable. In relation to 2050, the court said, look, the decision did take account of Paris and the Climate Change Act, and the conclusion was that the project would be close to net zero over its lifetime. So that the HS2 challenge failed. Drax recently got DCO, in 2018, they got a DCO for 2 gas-fired generators for electricity generation. The examining authorities, are basically the planning inspectorate, recommended refusal of the DCO, but the Secretary of State, Andrea Leadsom, overruled that. And Client Earth, the environmental legal campaign, has sought a JR of that decision. Nine grounds all failed, 2 of which related to greenhouse gases and net zero. The court said, look, greenhouse gases are relevant to the decision, but they're not inconsistent with the energy NPS, and you know, net zero is not incompatible with the policy statement at all. There are different pathways to getting to the result, and the Secretary of State can quite reasonably contemplate other mechanisms such as carbon capture or ETS. So the key takeaway here, I think the courts are probably unwilling to look at underlying policy as a means of knocking out consents for individual projects. And the MPS is not inconsistent with net zero, and the Secretary of State has quite a wide discretion as to how to build that energy mix up. There have been other challenges to London-based energy from waste schemes. Corey's Riverside is currently with the courts. Very similar grounds being argued to DRAC, so that may be withdrawn. And there was a Millstone which took on the North London waste energy scheme as well. And again, both were refused. So my conclusion: look, in a net zero green economy, in a climate emergency, infrastructure is always going to be closely scrutinised, even low carbon and renewables. So you look at the Cleve Hill solar DCO, which was granted a week or so ago. So much online about in the press decrying the loss of biodiversity and so forth. Notwithstanding, this is as renewable a source, energy source as they come. Construction impacted materials, for HS2, for example, they are always going to have a significant carbon impact, or else the projects are going to impact habitat. So again, that's going to be something that people will always challenge. Post-Paris, in the net zero world, it looks like there's going to be more difficulty in justifying policy that's out of step with those climate obligations. So all eyes on the Supreme Court. I think climate change arguments against individual projects look like a fairly tough ask at the moment. If they've been taken into account with policy, because the Secretary of State will be given some discretion. EIA will continue to be a good source for claimants. Failure to screen, failure to scope, cumulative impacts, off-site impacts have all been relevant in the courts too. I suspect I've overstepped my 5 minutes, but thank you for listening. Back to you in the newsroom, Rufus.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Luke. What we'll now do is throw some questions at you, both related to your own comments and to the topic. So the first question we have in is a question to you, Lucy, saying, can you clarify what you meant regarding whether or not the Rochdale envelope works when considering climate impacts?
Yeah, sure. No, I think the approach is fine. I was just for a couple of schemes we've worked on, thinking of difficulties at the outline stage, particularly for projects where clients are looking for a lot of flexibility, and whether and how easy it is to get data, particularly on the greenhouse gas emissions side, where you can actually assess in a quantitative way what your sort of the carbon impacts could be. So, for example, good sources of information for that sort of greenhouse gas emissions assessment for an operational phase of a development would normally be things like the energy use or otherwise of the buildings you're putting in, and then also transport's another key one. So the sort of vehicles, whether that's particularly motorised transport going to and from the site users, and that I think can be more easily estimated at outline if you assume a worst case scenario in terms of the uses you're proposing in trips. But the energy one's quite difficult, and I think particularly for had a few examples of large scale commercial developments where you're looking at a whole suite of land uses across, for example, the B classes, commercial and industrial, with potential for energy uses. And of course, you're not applying for any buildings. You've only got maybe an illustrative master plan, which of course we wouldn't want to test because it might not be worst case. So it's just how you can usefully get sufficient data that allows a quantitative assessment. And then if you need to do something very high level that's qualitative, does that allow a realistic worst case to be assessed, and how useful is that to the authority looking at that application?
Thank you, Lucy. Luke, Ben, do you want to comment on sort of Rochdale envelope combined with estimating worst case or realistic worst case scenarios, particularly around outline applications regarding climate change?
I can jump in. I mean, I think there's a fundamental, the difference in the way that we're looking at climate change, because it's an effect on the scheme, and as well as an effect of the scheme, and that could be hard to look at. And that granularity that Lucy talked about, you know, the emission scenarios, you know, aren't necessarily at that micro scale. You know, they're at grid squares, say, you know, they're at a slightly larger one. So I think there is attention to doing that, and you know, the future climate change scenarios, you know, there's a wide range of those, and you know, is it proportionate to take the worst case? Maybe it is, but maybe it depends on the nature of the project involved as well. So I think there's quite a lot of variables there. I think what is definitely needed is a clear statement about how what approach has been taken, what scenarios have been considered, and how that's carrying through. I think especially at outline stage.
Yeah, Rufus, I was just going to add that you know, I agree with both comments there, but I wonder whether we'll start to see greater use of EIA or environmental statements being submitted at reserved matters. Obviously, the 2014 directive and 2017 regs have introduced that, but certainly in my practice, I've not seen that being used particularly often, and it strikes me that climate change is potentially one of those areas as, you know, either science evolves or, you know, we've had stricter requirements where developers will feel more comfortable into reducing the likelihood for challenge by submitting additional information in reserved matters around, you know, around some of these areas of uncertainty. And you know, we might even see, you know, stretching that point further, that, you know, post-COVID transport assessments are going to be all over the place, I guess, as we're either piling into cars again. That's going to potentially produce some difficult data to deal with in environmental statements. And again, whether we'll see that sort of refined as the project or scheme is developed at reserved matters.
Thanks, Ben. If I can just pick up on the sort of duality point that Luke picked up on, that you're assessing the impact of climate change on the development, and you're also assessing the impact of the development on climate change. And Lucy also mentioned the EIA guidance on GHGs. It's probably worth saying that EIA recognises that kind of dual cumulative aspects. And we have two guides to impact assessment. One is the Climate Change Resilience and Adaptation 2015, which talks about how the project can take account of climate change in terms of its design. And that speaks really to Lucy's earlier points about bringing climate change into the design process, and also to Luke's points about, well, I think both their points about making the project making the environment better with the project rather than just minimizing impacts. And the second guide then is the EIA Guide to Assessing Greenhouse Gas Emissions and Evaluating Their Significance. That's 2016, which talks more about the actual calculations. And it's worth saying that we have actually just finished updating the Climate Change Resilience and Adaptation V2, which will be 2020, and that's actually going to press as we speak and will be out shortly. So look out for the launch webinar on the EIA website. And regarding the GHG guidance, we've also just re-engaged the original author team to begin the update cycle of that one, which I would hope to come out in the future. So any thoughts on my mention of the guidance there, or would you like to hear another question?
I think it's a question.
Yep, okay, great. I think it was Luke who talked about waiting for national policy to cascade down. But one of the questioners here is saying, do we need to wait, or how can we use projects to influence local and regional policy?
Well, I'll make a start on that since I mentioned it. I don't think we need to wait, but I think that there needs to be strong steer, especially at regional level, to weigh up the different benefits and potential disbenefits of different schemes. So if we're talking about that every ton of carbon dioxide emitted is significant, some regional authorities, so some combined authorities, for example, are starting to think in terms of regional carbon budgets, and really that needs some kind of administration. But I absolutely don't think that projects should be waiting to do stuff. I think projects need to be setting ambition and articulating ambition and benefit already. However, it will be necessary. You can't, you can't just have all of one type of project in one region. You're going to need a blend of things, and actually some will be able to do more than others. So there will be more biodiversity net gain perhaps available in certain projects compared to other ones. And I think that's where that localism thing comes in, and the regionalism, where actually strong leadership and strong steer and strong administration of those benefits can help to join those up. Because taking the biodiversity as a topic, it's not just having great quality habitat in one place, which, although that is really good and we need more of that, but it's the connections between it, and individual projects can rarely solve a lot of that connectivity issue. You need that broader perspective on it. So I think absolutely it's both projects. We need to be ambitious in the projects we're doing now, but we also we need to be calling for and contributing to that that cascade down, and in the communities where we live as well, speaking up and saying, well, this is what we want, because we can see from the cases that Ben's talked about that actually we have a voice, and that the voice of the citizen is increasingly important, especially because you can do the best EIAs in the world and produce the most clear and proportionate environmental statements, but the decision making beyond that is the critical thing, and often that has political elements, with a small p and a large p, and those political decisions are influenced by citizens. So yeah.
Thank you.
Rufus, Ben, can I just add
sure.
a small comment to supplement what Rufus suggested there? Obviously we because of the current crisis, we're having a lot of local planning authority decisions, a lot of meetings being held online, and I think overall pretty successfully. And I wonder whether that increases access to decision making for the community. So as Luke said, government set this net zero target, declared a climate emergency, and have just been quiet ever since. And admittedly, they've had other things in terms of Brexit and the coronavirus on their hands. But we've got a dearth of policy, dearth of legislation around here. So it's all gone back to stakeholders. It's all gone back to employees of businesses, investors in businesses, and as Luke said, the man on the street. So I think by having online access to decisions, more of us will be able to join committee hearings and be able to voice our concerns or support of schemes. So I think going forward, environmental statements need to be far more accessible. I know we've had the non-technical summaries for a long time, but I can really foresee that actually a lot more of this technical information, a lot more of the environmental statements will be read, will be looked at, and people will be commenting on it and having a vocal reaction to it. So I think, Luke said we shouldn't be waiting for policy to drip down. Absolutely agree with that. But I think, the quid pro quo developers or promoters are going to have to start telling a bit more of a story in some of the environmental statement chapters, and not necessarily selling it, but explaining more clearly what the benefits of the project are.
Thank you. Lucy, any thoughts on that, or would you like to move on to another question?
I won't repeat it. I mean, I agree actually with what both said then, but I think as well, just given the rise of sort of increased consciousness and public opinion in this, and I would say also, I think as practitioners, our jobs have been made a little bit easier in that I think a lot more developers in particular are now on side with this. I think we're hopefully almost at the stage, maybe apart from Trump, but I don't think we're at a stage where people are sort of saying, oh, the science is wrong, and this is costing money. I think given, Bloomberg and all different financial institutions, everybody knows that tackling climate change, both mitigating and making sure our development is resilient, makes financial sense. it is not just the right thing to do, but it is the only way for a sustainable economy. So I think that's on our side. So I think that really, really helps in the as policy trickles down. I think a lot more development promoters actually now get it, and they see the value of having environmental professionals involved through that design.
Thank you, Lucy. The question I have here, we mentioned, or rather, Luke mentioned politics with a large P and a small p. Given, I'd quite like you guys to discuss the DRAX decision. So in this particular case, we had the environmental impact assessment work, we had the expert opinions, it was examined by the independent examining authority, the planning inspectorate. They recommended that it should be refused, and then the Secretary of State decided to ignore the scientific, legal and expertise advice and make a decision to go ahead nevertheless. And I think Ben already mentioned that the appeal against that was refused, etc. So how much is this a problem for EIA if at the end of a very long rational legal process it can be overturned just on the basis of who happens to be in charge at the time? Discuss.
Shall I go first? I mean, it's a tricky one. It's a frustrating one. I don't really feel there's a lot that people can do about it other than, you know, you prepare as professionals, prepare the environmental statement, undertake the impact assessment as thoroughly as possible. You know, submit your case, and you can't really sort of legislate, but as a developer of politics, obviously with the local authority and local members, you can talk to them about the scheme and so forth. But ultimately, you know, at a national level, the Secretary of State, like, you know, call in for town and country planning will take into account factors that mere mortals such as those was on this webinar just wouldn't be able to comprehend, or, you know, it's frustrating. But difficult to do.
I think it's just, if I can just jump in there, it's going back to what we were discussing a minute ago. I think, you know, as professionals, I'm sure many of whom are dialed onto this call, it's about engaging, and maybe as you know, we were talking about with COVID and the digital, the ability to take part in lobbying and you know, at committees, and then ultimately, I guess it's who you vote for, you know, isn't it? But it happens across the board. It's not just the environment really, but I think it's about participation, at least in the political process, and I hope that you can in some way make a difference, that, you know, through the channels available to us.
Yes.
And I think there's something in there about you know, so many of us who are environmental practitioners, you know, we are in this industry because we want to make a difference and we want to see a sustainable future, and we have to do that in lots of different ways, and I think both Lucy and Ben have alluded to that. You know, we need to recognize that the purpose of EIA, you know, it is to help make things more visible, but it isn't the decision making tool or person itself. You know, it is to make things more visible, and you know, we need to engage, but we also need to recognize that sometimes, you know, there are other factors, and we know that this is a very nuanced issue. You know, it's not black and white. You know, even within individual topics, there's a divergence of opinion or approach, and you have to look at this kind of multi-criteria analysis, and EIA helps us to do that. But we need to go further, and you know, we're not always going to necessarily see the outcome that we believe might be the right thing to do. So you know, yeah, it can feel disheartening, I suppose, when you know, only goes so far, but we have to recognize that this is just a particular vehicle for making things more visible, and actually even bringing these things to light is an important thing, and that was the purpose of EIA in the first instance.
Rufus, can I make just one more comment? That actually
Sure.
Just that sort of public engagement and working with the community sort of continues, and often we, you know, certainly as lawyers, we're very focused on getting our planning permission, getting our DCO waiting 6 weeks and then waiting an extra week just to be sure, and saying, well, great, we're JR free, the project can go ahead. But there was a claim last year, Millstone, which I very briefly mentioned, that the North London Heat and Power Project got its DCO back in 2017, and then a minor amendment to it. But in the post net zero world, that was challenged. A local campaigner wrote to the Secretary of State and said, you must revoke this DCO because there have been exceptional circumstances. And the lawyers on the line will know the Planning Act 2008 says, look, Secretary of State can revoke DCOs where there's a serious error that's inappropriate to change through other means, where the project's been abandoned or contravenes law or exceptional circumstances. Anyway, 2 years after the DCO was granted, that project was still being challenged in the courts, and so that need to sort of keep engaging just never goes away with local politicians, with MPs, because there's just so many decisions along the way of a project that if you get it wrong, you can be tripped up. And I think, as we've made clear, communities and climate change are great fellows, and people get it. People understand the power they've now got. So yeah, I think continuous involvement, it never stops, and lawyers, we need to stop talking about 6 weeks DCO and you're in the clear. So although the direct DCO was granted, I'm fairly sure that Client Earth and others will not be putting their papers in the file and looking the other way. There'll be many more decisions which will need public decisions to be taken to challenge. So yeah.
Well, another question then. I think it was Lucy who alluded to the difficulties at the EIA stage. You have the consideration of alternatives, but you're relatively limited in the scope of that, and therefore many of the arguments are at the EIA stage to deal with climate issues, particularly around alternatives, are actually too late in the process and probably needed to be tackled through a strategic environmental assessment at the plan or policy stage. We know that there's a very patchy implementation of strategic environmental assessment in the UK, and I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, this goes to the heart of one of the cases you mentioned, whereby the actual NPSs are now being challenged on the grounds that the actual policy itself hasn't appropriately taken account of climate change. And I wonder to some extent whereby that's actually the right place for the argument, and that if that's correctly undertaken, some of the issues that beset EIA will be less of an issue.
I think that's right. Certainly in relation, a lot of these national policy statements are pretty old now. Certainly pre-Paris, and back in the days, when we had 80% target for carbon reduction, not 100. So I think policy challenges are the better place for these discussions. I think it's pretty unfair on decision makers to have their decisions challenged when they've been taken on the back of those policies and done the process perfectly lawfully. So I expect the Bayes challenge will be successful. Less certain about the Highways England challenge, but yeah, entirely the right place to be doing it rather than at project level, I think.
Lucy, Luke, any thoughts on sort of SEA versus EIA and what's the appropriate point at which to bring in climate change?
Yeah, I think, if I'll just quickly say one quick point, I think it's essential that we do have a national approach and ambition. Obviously, we've got the net zero, the target, and that is gradually, slowly but surely trickling down. I think a lot of sort of sustainability appraisals or SEAs that I've looked at, often the climate change part is quite lacking in detail, and that's or I don't want to say weak. It's not always the fault of the consultant who's done it, I would say, or on behalf of the council, but it's just because they know that really when you're looking at, say, potential site allocations, all you've really got to go on is in terms of the suitability or not of a site and how sustainable it is where it's located. And historically we've looked at is it near a main road? Can we get around? And that's clearly not really the way we should be thinking now. But so much of the both mitigating through, reducing travel to start with, keeping people on site, and then obviously low carbon energy and sort of sustainable transport, all that stuff goes with it, really comes down to that project level. In terms of what you can sign up to on a particular site. So I think it's tricky at both levels, and often at SEA you see it written, oh yes, well, a site of this scale could potentially do all of these things, to be resilient to a changing climate and to reduce emissions, but they leave the detail. And then you could, if you wanted to fudge it, say that about most sites if you get the development phase, the project level right. So I think it gets, in my experience of reviewing these things, it's sort of been glossed over and then left to a later level, which isn't helpful. Whereas I think if we have the strong direction, then we have a joined up approach, both with a strategic view across the board, but taking the local considerations on board, then that will give a better steer to people trying to do these appraisals and assessments.
And I think, I think, as Lucy said, we do need it from both ends, and there's, a will from, designers want to do low carbon designs. But I think just on the SEA point, I think we might see some other articulation of regional and local ambition that goes alongside that. So many local authorities have declared a climate emergency, but not as many yet have set out the pathway to that. And I think it might be those pathway documents, the next step type documents, that I think are increasingly being shaped in a post-COVID lens for this kind of green recovery that people want. I think those are going to be really interesting documents which will start to steer the big questions about what type of development do we look like, or redevelopment, or what infrastructure do we really need, that precedes the detailed level assessment that we will be doing through EIAs.
Agreed. I don't know if I can make there's another webinar going on. I don't know if I can say this, but if you're interested, it's exact point. It's being infrastructure intelligence. So running one on Friday exactly about the role of infrastructure in kickstarting that post-COVID economic recovery. So if you haven't seen it, it might be a good one to register for, exactly on that point.
Yes, certainly. IEMA's using the phrase "build back better," and I think we're seeing that across a range of institutions, organisations, and in the public, that people don't want to go back to business as usual, and that there's an increased desire to do things better when we restart. One point I just want to pick up on that Lucy said about the difficulty at the strategic level. I think it's a critical point that's worth dwelling on for a moment, and that, just to give an example, with the Heathrow ANPS, the sort of get out of jail free card was climate and biodiversity and et cetera, will be dealt with at the project level. So I think it was your phrase, glossed over, to say it's passed down, as it were, the chain. So the question isn't answered, it's just deferred. And then at the environmental impact assessment level, when you do attempt to answer the questions, quite often the response to the answers is, well, it's too late, it's now national planning policy. So you get the answer against environmental damage the first time is you're premature in assessing the impacts. And then when you move to the next stage, it is you've missed the boat on assessing the environmental impacts. And that's a real danger, I think, that occurs, in my experience, time and again. And I think, therefore, a strengthening, although it's difficult, of the assessment of potential significant effects at the strategic or policy level, despite the lack of scheme detail, I think is critical that we really focus on in this next period.
I'd absolutely agree with that, and it goes back to a point that Luke was saying about a lot of issues just can't be dealt with, on an individual site by site level. It needs to be joined up. So like connectivity of biodiversity, and there's so many issues. Sustainable transport's another obvious one, and making sure our energy networks are resilient and we do all the upgrades we need to for, potential hydrogen or electric or whatever we're doing. That just can't be dealt with project by project. It has to have a national view taken. And with
Luke,
that, I'm really sorry, everyone,
yeah.
but I'm going to have to go to a meeting.
That's okay. Well, we are 3 minutes towards the end. Thank you, Lucy, for your contribution. Maybe one last question to Ben and Luke. Do you think that part of the problem is perhaps that taking away of that regional tier of policy?
I think whether you phrase it as it's part of the problem, I think there's definitely a need for it, and I think, but we're starting to see that re-emerge with the different regional devolution deals, the metro mayors articulating things on a more regional level and having powers to do that as well. Not every combined authority has got planning powers, but you can see where it would be really helpful to do that. So. And it does feel like a bit of a cycle, where, kind of some kind of regional development plans appear, and then, they're very politically driven, and they disappear for a little bit, and then they resurface later. So sure. I think we definitely need it. Yeah.
Yeah, I would have. That's right. I think my concern is that we have a national policy, but just no detail. We don't have a roadmap how we're going to be doing all this kind of stuff, and I think that's the bigger initial issue. It may be as we progress, we need more regional detail, but at the moment it's an umbrella policy with lacking detail. And if you look to other countries, the EU, for example, they have a fabulous Green Deal. It's pretty clear how they're going to get to net zero. So I think
okay. Well, that takes us towards the end of our allotted time. It just leaves me to thank again Lucy, Luke and Ben, and also Waterfront for organising the session. I hope it was useful for the listeners, and I'll see you again, I'm sure, on other webinars and events. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rufus. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.